Hello, welcome back to the second part of our Bible study, looking at the second half of Matthew's Gospel. Today we are looking at chapters 19, 20, 21 and 22. 4 chapters. I know it's a lot to get through, but Matthew's Gospel, the chapters sort of get longer as you get towards the end. So we need to cover quite a lot of ground in order to be close to the story of Christ's passion and resurrection as we near that liturgically. So we do have 4 chapters to look at today, lots of Jesus teaching, knowing that he is heading towards Holy Week and Easter. And it's important to keep that in mind. And indeed, in the centre of these 4 chapters, the beginning of chapter 21, we'll have the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. So he physically enters Jerusalem for the last time in the middle of these 2 chapters, but they're surrounded by lots of teaching. And the other nice thing about these 4 chapters, taking them as a block, is that we begin with what can be quite a challenging paragraph on divorce, in which the Pharisees come to him and ask, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause? But you'll notice by the time we get to the end of chapter 22, it's the Sadducees, a different religious sect, coming to Jesus and asking, if there's no resurrection, if a man dies childless and his brother marries his widow, then whose husband is she, or whose wife is she? So 2 parables, we can call them that, or 2 stories about interactions with the Pharisees and the Sadducees about marriage and about divorce and about how that might interact with our understanding of what this new kingdom of heaven looks like. And so we might ask why Matthew chose to include both of those stories with the different religious sects at this point in his gospel, and what he might be trying to say, because marriage has, for a long time, long before Matthew, been seen as a social contract, as a way of managing and demonstrating to the wider society what is important about our relationships. And our modern marriage liturgy says that. It says marriage is a gift of God in creation. It enriches society. What it means by that is that gift, unconditional gift of love from one person to another, given because we have chosen one person to give it to, is a reflection of that choice to love each one of us that God offers to us. Now, God has it in his capacity to choose each and every one of us on a special and particular level. But that reflects something of the beauty and tenderness and delight that God takes in each one of us. And that's why, as a church, we can say we have both that personal relationship with God and a communal relationship with God, because God has chosen each and every one of us and has a particular calling and a particular way of life that he calls each one of us to. And that's important for Jesus' teaching about, in response to the Pharisees' question about a man and divorce, because by the end of this conversation, the disciples have realized what Jesus is up to, but are wanting to push him further, and realize that for the Pharisees, the law of Moses is important, and therefore Jesus goes back to teach what was really on Moses' heart when he discerned the law. Remember, Jesus doesn't come to remove the law or to get rid of the law, to supplant the law, but to help us interpret the law according to his ways of grace and love. And so he's asking, well, what actually was on Moses' heart when he told the Israelite people that they could consider divorce? And he says, well, actually, it was in order to preserve their society, their way of life, in order to make sure that they could have good relationships and good ways of managing their homes and their industry and their lives together. because Moses knew that to lock them into abusive practices was not going to help them. But they needed a codified way of dealing uh, with problems that had arisen from their following of the law. So that's what Moses did for them, and that's what the Pharisees are asking about. And they're trying to trip Jesus up by playing one piece of the law against another. And so Jesus says, I say to you, you Pharisees in particular, whoever divorces his wife except for unchastity and marries another commits adultery. But I do wonder if he is speaking directly to the Pharisees who are trying to trip him up at that point, because he can see what's on their heart and why they are trying to ask that question. The disciples probe him further, talking about then, well, is it not better for a man not to marry at all? This is particularly hard because Jesus is talking to men, so they are talking about men. And I wonder how the conversation would go if there were women involved or if it was about women in marriage and divorce, but this is the text we're given. And Jesus says, well, yes, actually, there is a good way of life for those who commit themselves to voluntary celibacy as well. But that's not for everyone, he said. Remember, I said the Spirit has a particular calling for each one of us. And Jesus is saying, consider what is your calling. This sort of celibacy is not good for everybody, but far from it, he says. But actually for those who are called to that way of life, for the sake of the kingdom of heaven, should accept it if they can. For the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Again, the role of a eunuch in politics for at Jesus' time was important because it was a time eunuchs were people who could be guaranteed wouldn't use their own sexual interests to disturb the political allegiances. I said marriage was used as a way of influencing culture and society and politics too. So eunuchs wouldn't use their own sexual interests to do that. They couldn't. And so eunuchs were particularly important as ambassadors, as negotiators, because there was some level of trust perceived. So eunuchs had a particular political role. So you can see the disciples thinking about what that means and how they might be used in this new kingdom that Jesus is bringing in. And yet that follows on straight away to blessing children. And of course, if everyone were a eunuch, we wouldn't have any children. So that's Jesus' way, perhaps, of reminding the disciples that actually one of the things we are also called to is to raise children, and not just to have children, but actually to raise, to teach them, to bring them into the kingdom of heaven. What then should the rich young man do in order to enter the kingdom of heaven? And he reckons that he's followed all these commandments, done all these things. What still do I lack? If Jesus is saying, well, money doesn't matter, is that what he's saying? Then the man feels that he's followed all the rules. But Jesus says, no, quite the opposite. Money does matter. What we do with our money really matters. And so he directs this young man to go sell your possessions and give the money to the poor. Again, if you need a reminder that these instructions are not for everybody. There's a famous story about Antony the hermit in Egypt, who heard this verse and did exactly that. Decided that was his calling, to be a hermit in the desert in Egypt. And so he did that. He sold all his possessions, gave them to the poor, or the money that they raised to the poor, and he went to live as a hermit. Again, not everybody can do that. If everybody did that, then we would not have a church, we would not have a society, we would not have an economy, we would not have a community. And those things are good. We cannot all do that. But we do need some people who follow that call to the extreme because they have a church around them, because they have a fellowship around them who can support them to do that. So voluntary celibacy, voluntary poverty, these are good in certain circumstances, in certain situations, and they should remind us all that being generous with our possessions, that being chaste, are good things too, and we should practice those things insofar as it is appropriate for each one of us. Peter recognizes that he indeed has done that. He's given up his livelihood. He left his father's fishing business back on the seashore at Galilee, and left all that behind. Not to ignore it. Blessed are you, Jesus has just said a couple of chapters ago. Simon, son of Jonas. He is still referred to by his patronymic, by the name of his father. So his origin, his heritage, his family upbringing is important. All the more so because Peter has consciously decided to leave it behind. And now Jesus introduces this language of the 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. So now Jesus, as well as key holder, as well as witness, is introducing some more language about what role the disciples might have in this kingdom. Judge. And if you think back to the book of Judges, which we haven't studied yet in our Bible study at St Mary's, Haverhill and Withersfield, but the book of Judges, the people asked to have judges because they couldn't decide or make decisions for themselves, and it was too much just to have one kingly authority. Or in fact, what we did study was Moses, who appointed judges initially because it was too much for Moses to be judging, discerning all the conflicts and tensions that the people of Israel had. So in both those cases, the people were given judges who could hold some of that authority in a sort of interim capacity. So they would be able to devolve from the king that that dispensation of judgment in order to say, well, actually, this way is good and this way is not. And that's what we're saying. So having had these discussions about marriage and chastity, about poverty and money and possessions, Jesus then says, well, actually, there is going to be a need to make discernment, to make judgment in all these cases, and you, the apostles, are the ones who are going to help do that. And what is judgment but bringing things into the light so that we can see what is good and so we can get rid of what is bad. That's all Jesus wants from us. That's all he's asking the apostles, the disciples, the 12 of them to do. He also talks in other language about laborers in the vineyard, and he has this parable about hiring the laborers. Again, a parable about money, about wealth, and about conflict, because actually he's saying that the value that we ascribe to one another and to the things that we do can introduce conflict. And so he's saying, what should we do? Well, actually, he's saying when I hire the people, it's not what I am paying them that's important. It's the fact that I have this contract with them to do a job and to be remunerated for it. So this is Jesus saying what is important in judgment is recognizing where the true value lies, and that is recognizing the worth of our efforts and our person. That is what Jesus invites us to see. It's not about earning so much money because you did so much work. Quite the opposite. But earning so much money, being remunerated, being valued in such a way that who you are and what you are doing, whatever that is recognized and affirmed. The mother of the sons of Zebedee recognizes that there might be an opportunity, therefore, if certain people are to be judges, certain people are to be given certain levels of authority, certain people are given certain roles in this kingdom, perhaps there is something for her sons, James and John, to have alongside Peter. So notice that it was Peter, James, and John who went up the mountain. Peter has already had this commission to be the key holder, the one on whom the church will be built, the rock. Peter has had that. James and John haven't had anything, and so perhaps their mother is feeling slightly left out. And so she goes to Jesus and says, please declare that these two sons of mine will sit, one at your right hand and one at your left in your kingdom. So she has recognized what is important, not what they do or the jobs that they're given, but actually where they sit, how close they are to Jesus, where that authority lies. And Jesus doesn't dismiss her request outright. He almost affirms her in saying that actually, yes, you've noticed something really important, but do you actually know what that means in terms of the suffering and the pain and the death that will come to me, to Jesus? And she says, well, that Jesus says, that's not mine to grant. That would be God the Father. But that introduces conflict, as we've already seen. That will introduce conflict. All of these questions of authority and discernment do often introduce conflict, and that's not a good thing by any means. And part of our the hard work of being called to live in this kingdom is because that discernment and working out what is good and working out what is God's will for each of us is hard work. And we do need to work at it alongside one another. Because if I have a personal calling and you have a personal calling, what happens if we see those things in conflict, in tension? Matthew's Gospel gives us some answers as to how that might work, that doesn't result in military aggression, as he sees in the world around him and as we see in the world around him, because that is not the answer. But actually, Jesus' victory over sin and death is the answer. That we should be able to reconcile with one another and recognize the good and the good intentions in one another, and to challenge one another gently too, and therefore to help one another. It's at that point then that Jesus arrives in Jerusalem, and he comes in riding on a donkey, partly to fulfill the prophecy found in the book of Zephaniah that the king will come riding on a donkey. That's quoted in 21:5, but also because the king would traditionally be seen riding on a horse, not a donkey. And so this is about humility. This is about making absolutely clear that this is not a military coup, but is Jesus riding willingly to his betrayal, arrest, torture, and death, and to his resurrection. And so the crowds shout, Hosanna, Hosanna to the Son of David. And that over the next couple of chapters will be an important refrain, because if you look down at 21:15, they're still crying out, Hosanna to the Son of David, and the chief priests and the scribes become angry at that. Why? Because that word Hosanna means save us. It's a spiritual word, not a political word. And that perhaps is concerning the scribes and the elders more than it would be if this was a military coup, because they know how to deal with that. They've got occupying forces, they've got soldiers who can deal with insurrection. But actually, Hosanna to the Son of David, that's making a very clear religious, cultural, spiritual statement that the people see in Jesus, the one called to redeem them, not to rescue them, but to reconcile them to God. That means that when Jesus does turn over the temple, in the temple, the tables of the money changers, it's not a violent, aggressive action designed to incite conflict, but is a physical sign of the upset that Jesus sees in what the people, and particularly the leaders of the temple, have done to what should be sacred space. Now, remember, in Christian thought, we talk about our bodies being the temples of the Holy Spirit. So what would it mean to be using our bodies as signals of that misplaced worth? And how should we challenge that in our lives? And there's lots of answers to that, as we've said, in Matthew's Gospel. There's some teaching then on authority. Jesus looks at the fig tree, and we've got another reflection on movement, and the fig tree withers. Jesus refers back to what he said to the disciples before about moving mountains and says, well, I haven't moved a mountain, but actually I have caused the fig tree to wither. I do have that authority over creation. And the disciples are amazed, they wonder, they're intrigued by the physical outworking of this of Jesus' statements. So there's this constant back and forth between Matthew spiritualizing some of the things that Jesus says about, for example, money or victory or announcing the coming of a new kingdom, but also saying, but that doesn't remove us from the reality of our earthly life. And that's very true today, that we have to work out how to live within an earthly kingdom alongside the values that we know come from being a disciple, a child of God. And that's why I think that today, in particular, reading Matthew's Gospel is so helpful and so important, particularly as we see so many earthly kingdoms in conflict and so many earthly kingdoms distracted and distorted by a love of money and value in other things, power, that are contrary to the teachings of Jesus about the kingdom of heaven. That has some questions for where Jesus is getting this authority to say these things, because if Jesus is saying that, for example, we should see the true value in the money that we exchange, and not just the value that's given to it by a legal and economic system. Who is Jesus to say that? Is that not Jesus setting up an alternative political, social, economic system? Jesus says no, but Jesus doesn't say that. Jesus gets the crowd to acknowledge, to see, to discern, to judge that Jesus' authority comes from no human origin. And that's important, because then he's giving that gift of judgment, of discernment to the people, but he is also not just exerting power over them. remember our reflections from Moses on power and control. And that's important too about the kingdom of heaven, that although Jesus has it in his gift to give, he doesn't control through that giving. That means that he makes himself fun, because in giving freely without control, we make ourselves vulnerable. And he has two more parables about that, not least because he knows that that will mean in giving of himself, he will be led to death. Then chapter 22 begins with a parable about the wedding banquet. And again, if we see this in terms of giving, but in terms of control and in terms of being welcome, then it might help to explain again a difficult passage where somebody without the means to buy a wedding robe is found at the wedding banquet and then thrown out because he's not dressed in the right attire. Why? Because this is a parable about being worthy and about demonstrating our worthiness, not, as Matthew said, because we want to practice our piety before others, but because actually we need to demonstrate on the inside that we are truly respectful of the fact that we are members of the kingdom of heaven. And I wonder if that is where that parable is leading us. We have another question about paying taxes and the question about the resurrection and about marriage. Just notice in the question about taxes then that Jesus, having before said, look at the value of the coin, he's now saying, look at whose head is on the coin. So a different interpretation of how we approach money. Actually, what authority does this money carry but the authority of the emperor whose head is on this coin? Another way of assessing the value of the coin, but linking back to the stories we've heard before. In that case, the question was in chapter 17. The question about the resurrection links back to what we saw asked from the Pharisees at the start of chapter 19. And again, the Sadducees link back to Moses, but the Sadducees have a different interpretation of Moses' law to the Pharisees. So we get another opportunity to think about marriage and the resurrection. And what is important, Jesus says, ultimately, is that God is not God of the dead, but of the living. And our life should reflect the values of love of the kingdom of heaven. And if you need any further encouragement to that assessment, in the very next paragraph, Jesus says, now in response to the Pharisees again, which is the greatest of the laws, he says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Those are the laws. The kingdom needs laws. Those are the laws which we should follow as members of the kingdom of heaven. It is that simple. And all those questions about conflict, all those questions about authority, all those questions about value stem from our understanding of what it means to love the Lord our God, to love our neighbour, and to love ourselves. It sounds simple, but as we carry on, we will recognise that Jesus lives out what that love means through the cross and the empty tomb. So some challenging parables, some challenging teachings, some challenging stories, but I hope to read them in the context of this leading from the Transfiguration to the entry into Jerusalem to the events of Holy Week and Easter. Helps to put them into a little bit of context and actually helps us to understand what's going on in the world around us as well. It's not easy, but we keep reading, we keep discerning, and we keep loving. because that is what God calls us to. So thank you for being with me again this time. We've got one more Bible study for March and then April as well, looking at the Gospel of Matthew. Take care.